Hello and welcome to this video on using your spent grains from brewing beer in another way. All grain or partial grain mashing for beer produces waste of a sort. This is the grains you used as the basis for your wort. You could dispose of these as waste or find a use for it. If you're inclined to minimizing your waste, then spent grain bread is a good option. Historically, most countries with a strong beer culture have found ways to use their spent grains and the brewing yeast to make something more productive after the fact, whether this is using the brewing yeast to make bread itself, or, as in the case of Germany, to make a bread from the grain. To make a German spent grain bread, you'll need a variety of ingredients. This includes your bread flour, a second, more dense flour, wholemeal being better, a little bit of salt, a baker's yeast, your spent grains from making beer, some honey or a similar sugar substitute, egg, and milk. The recipe itself is more in line with a cake in some respects than a bread, but this is necessary when you consider some of the things that are done during the mashing process. Once you have all of your ingredients together, you then need to begin putting them into the right proportions in the right way. The proportions we've used are about 1 part bread flour to a half part wholemeal flour and approximately 1 part spent grain. You'll also require about 50 milliliters of honey, about 100 milliliters of milk, and at least 2 eggs in this case. Begin by combining your dry ingredients. After this, add your yeast. In this case, we've used an activated yeast. Then add your honey, eggs, and milk. Combine this, in this case with a dough hook, very slowly. Because we're making ours more wet than usual, you'll note that it doesn't come together as a dough ball. Rather, it holds its shape in a very lumpy way, looking almost like oatmeal, or porridge if you're more familiar with that. Once you've combined it, leave it to rest for about an hour. Then come back after you've let it rise for that hour, and you should notice it's increased in size. Once this has happened, we divide ours into 2 loaves, each one going into their own tray. Depending on the size and how much of it you are making, you may need to make more loaves or divide it differently or not divide it at all. Make sure when you put these into their trays that you oil them slightly. This will ensure they don't stick when baking. While it rises a second time, start warming your oven. Set your oven to warm to about 200 degrees Celsius. When you go to bake it, you'll lower this to about 160 to 180 degrees, though this will vary slightly depending on your oven. You'll know that the loaves are ready to go in the oven when they have again doubled in size. Once you begin baking the bread, it should take about half an hour in the oven. You'll know it's done by being able to tap on the bottom of the pan and you'll hear a hollow sound. The top should be nicely browned as well. Once you've taken them out of the oven, put them to a side to cool for 10 to 15 minutes. At the end of this time, you should be able to turn the pan over, tap it on the bench, and the loaf should just fall out. Once the loaf is out of the pan, leave it to rest and cool for about half an hour, if not more. This will ensure that when you go to cut it, it has a nice solid shape. That solid shape means that your loaf will not collapse as you are cutting slices. This recipe differs significantly from the last recipe that we made a video on, This recipe calls for the inclusion of eggs, milk, and honey. This does make it somewhat closer to a cake than bread, but it's still delicious and relatively easy to make. The advantages of this are that the inclusion of those grains adds a little more bite and flavour to this than simply making bread by itself. It's also a useful way to avoid waste unnecessarily. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.